Well, just in the last couple of days, we've got some new data coming in from Nielsen, which for many decades has been the television audience measurement company of record. They sit there and collect data from all across North America, trying to find out what people are watching on TV through linear content delivery. And that is the kind of delivery that we're used to for decades and decades around the globe, where you have a broadcast antenna or a cable system or a satellite TV subscription, and you're getting your content delivered through one of those types of providers. Well, of course, with streaming, this has made things much more difficult to understand really who is watching what, because the metrics of measuring this kind of data have been all over the place, with Samba TV actually capturing as best they can household measurements, which we've talked about here on Valiant Renegade a number of times. Nielsen is doing things a little bit differently, measuring total minutes watched of a given program or movie that may be on a streaming services. Both of these types of measurements obviously have their own inherent problems. We're going to talk about some of that data today, especially when it comes to two of the biggest new things on streaming services right now, and that is, of course, Cobra Kai on Netflix, and then Disney Plus with its own slate, including Encanto and the Book of Boba Fett. Stay tuned. Here we go. Renegade Online. Well, welcome back, folks. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. Please, if you are like one of the 60 or 70% of folks out there watching this video that are not yet subscribed, well, I hope you take care of that today. Please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and do, of course, make sure you leave a comment before you head out the door today. We've got a lot to discuss, and I just want to take a second before we get into it just to thank everybody who has been watching the videos, all those who have subscribed. The channel continues to grow at a rapid pace. We are approaching 5,000 subscribers. And just as another brief announcement, we will be doing our very first live stream Thursday night this week on February 3rd at 6 p.m. U.S. Central Standard Time. Renegade Online will launch. That will be a special one-off time to celebrate the one-year anniversary of this channel at Valiant Renegade. Hope to see all of you folks there. Come join us. We're just going to kind of goof off and have a party. No particular agenda. We should have some fun guests popping in. And also on that note, there is now a second channel, sister channel to this one called Renegade Online. We'll leave a link in the description below this video. That will be the repository for all the live streams once they've completed. So let's talk about this. This is an article from Deadline magazine, which of course we always like to, check out Deadline. They have a lot of great data. They do, I think, my opinion, they do more of a data side of things in Hollywood than some of the other publications do. They love to get into the numbers more, especially with box office and, box office reports and things like that. So now Variety and Hollywood Reporter and a lot of the other magazines out there also cited this new Nielsen data, but we're going to use Deadline for this article today. Now, one of the things I want to call to your attention is that, of course, that this is data that came from the final New Year's week of 2021. Nielsen, unfortunately, it seems to take them quite some time to actually get data out. They seem to be on average about 3 to 4 weeks behind where we are on the calendar. So if we're getting data from Nielsen today, it's probably what happened 3 to 4 weeks ago, which is fine because the New Year's week, obviously, we had a lot of stuff that landed on some major streaming platforms. It does give us a glimpse into it. I want to talk about today some of the things that it does let us know, and then, of course, some of the things that it leaves kind of in the fog for us to really just kind of guess at. So let's read from the article. Riding its season 4 premiere, Karate Kid Reprise Cobra Kai topped Nielsen's U.S. streaming chart for the week of December 27th to January 2nd, with more than 2.4 billion with a B minutes of viewing. Minutes of viewing. We're going to talk about that in a minute because there's some good things and there's some problems with that. The series outdistanced two feature films that both cracked the 2 billion minute mark during New Year's week. Encanto, which became accessible to all Disney Plus subscribers just 30 days after its Thanksgiving debut in theaters. And we talked about that came out on December 24th, Christmas Eve. It finished with the number 2, Encanto did, finished with the number 2 spot at 2.2 billion minutes viewed during that week, while Netflix's Don't Look Up captured about 2 billion, good for third place. Cobra Kai's latest batch of 10 original episodes, that's key to remember, arrived in the same release slot as Season 3 a year ago, with the show generating 2.6 billion minutes of streaming. The series originated as a YouTube original, migrating to Netflix in 2020 ahead of YouTube's strategic pivot back to its roots in creator-driven programming, of course. It's one of the reasons I remember signing up for the old service YouTube Red when it came out, was because of Cobra Kai Season 1. Encanto, which grossed about $230 million worldwide at the box office and unfortunately did not turn a profit, they suffered a loss on that, of course, had its first full week on Disney+, starting to stream on December 24th. A month-long window marked a significant shift from previous Disney theatricals. 25% of its viewing in Hispanic households, 40% of it from kids aged 2 to 11 years old. No surprise there. And that is key because that is, as we've talked about here before, the younger audiences, the under 18s, and especially like the under 12, 13, 14s, that really is still Disney Plus's biggest audience by far, with a lot of rewatchability. Think about all the old content they have on there, the library of things like Mickey Mouse Clubhouse and all the old cartoon shows that, imagine households of families that, mom and dad are doing something and the kids are sitting there in front of Disney Plus watching a swath of classic Disney content for perhaps hours on end in many cases during any given day. Star-packed, this is on Don't Look Up. Let me skip on that one because I want to focus on just Cobra Kai and Book of Boba Fett and Encanto for the sake of this. But let's talk about some of the particulars. The streaming chart, this is Nielsen, tracks viewing only via a television screen. Another key point to remember, meaning that mobile is not counted. And in that case, nor are computers. Numbers from Disney+, Hulu, Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, and Apple TV are released after a delay of several weeks. One prominent title that Disney Star Wars-derived series is The Book of Boba Fett did not appear in the top 10. At 38 minutes long, the show's pilot episode drew 389 million minutes of viewing, which landed it in the number 8 spot on the all-original list, not the overall list. It did not make the top 10 on the overall. Because Disney Plus typically releases single episodes at a time, the series is likely to gain momentum in the coming weeks. We've talked about that before. I seriously doubt that comes to fruition, obviously, with the exception of this past week's episode that we saw the return of a majorly popular Star Wars character in terms of Din Djarin coming back on the show. I think that was a big push up. And of course, we talked about in a previous video how the writing, the pacing, the production value of this episode 5 of Book of Boba Fett seemed starkly different from what we have gotten up to this point, and it led to some speculation on my part that maybe Jon Favreau was much more focused not only on that episode with Bryce Dallas Howard, who was the guest director for that episode 5, but also perhaps for episodes 6 and 7, which episode 7, the final episode of this, what we presume at this point is a limited series of only this one season, will also be debuting just 14 hours before the next Walt Disney Company public stockholder quarterly report, which will be that afternoon at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time on February 9th. Book of Boba Fett will come out at 2 a.m. Central Standard Time that same February 9th morning. Now, they go into some other things, but of course we have here, you can see who the top 10 were, and I want you to take a look at this real quick. Cobra Kai, Encanto, Don't Look Up, The Witcher, Emily in Paris, CoComelon, which that's another interesting story because, of course, CoComelon was purchased away from YouTube for a huge sum of money by Netflix. And if you're looking at 354 episodes of this, and this is where the problem comes in. Is because if you look at something like this article discussed with Book of Boba Fett, it had one episode. Now, it said 38 minutes. But the actual real runtime, once you kick out the credits at the end, unless everybody sat there and watched the 3 to 5 minutes of credit, the real runtime was closer to 33 to 35 minutes on the actual show itself. And to be fair, when you look at things like Cobra Kai, each of those episodes came in at around an average of 30 minutes. So a total of about 5 hours over the course of those 10 episodes. And this is where some of the problems start coming in, because we're measuring minutes watched. It doesn't tell us how many people might have watched something multiple times. Take Encanto is a great example. You know, Disney movies, cartoons like that, Pixar movies, any animated feature, anything that's directed at children. Obviously, kids tend to watch those things over and over and over again. It would not surprise me at all to learn that many of the views that Encanto got, or many of those minutes, were repetitive minutes with the same viewers. But let's talk about some of the breakdown. I mean, for argument's sake today, we're going to talk about assuming that everybody that watched this watched it a single time to see what we can come up with. Now, if we look at Cobra Kai and we assume that everybody that was watching Netflix, watching Cobra Kai in those opening days, watched it once, watched Encanto once, watched Book of Boba Fett, the single episode, once, it starts breaking down into some more interesting data. But again, of course, it doesn't really still paint us a full picture because we're making way too many assumptions on the data here, way too many variables that we don't know. Now, one of the things we've talked about in the past, and let's start with Book of Boba Fett right here. So these were the numbers from measurement competitor Samba TV. Now, of course, Samba has their own designs on how they measure these metrics. Samba TV claimed, now this is back shortly after Boba Fett release. This was the first 5 days of that only singular episode that had come out. 1.7 million U.S. households watched the premiere of the Book of Boba Fett during its first 5 days of streaming. Now, what's important about that number is that aligns with the measurement period that Nielsen used. Nielsen's 7-day week went from December 27th through January 2nd. Book of Boba Fett debuted on December the 29th, 2 days into that period that they were measuring. Both periods closed out on January 2nd. So we can look at this and say, okay, the data was coming from the same period. 1.7 million households is what Samba's claiming in those 5 days. However, if we go back and we look at the numbers that Nielsen came up with, and let me click over here. This is a list that Park Place did as well from this article, our friend over there at WDW Pro. You can see here the Book of Boba Fett comes in at number 8. Again, this is for original content only. This is not everything. This is not reruns of The Office and stuff like that. All that's thrown out. This is just strictly new original content that released that week. You look at Boba Fett, 389 million minutes watched. Now, if we do some simple math on that and assume roughly 30 to 35 minutes of actual view time in that episode, kicking out the credits at the end that I'm sure just about nobody really watches, right? You kick that out and you come up with a little over 11 million views on that program in its opening week. That's pretty darn good. But again, that is assuming that everybody or 11 million people watched that first episode one time. So how do we go from presuming, in the case of Samba TV, that is claiming 1.7 million households watched it, to then coming over here and extrapolating the data from Nielsen that would suggest, if we use the same type of measurement, one customer, one watch, 11 million plus views. That's a stunning disparity between the numbers. And this is why streaming data measurement is so difficult. We really don't know. What this would suggest, they both could be right. They both could be right in the sense that Samba TV measured 1.7 million households viewed the Book of Boba Fett. Now, Samba claims that the way they measure it is that you have to watch at least 5 minutes of a given program that they are engaged in measuring for it to count as a view. And presumably, it doesn't count a repetitious viewing of that same program. It just says, no, you watched it. Whether you watched it once, twice, or 3 times, you watched it. That counts as a view. Hence, 1.7 million households based on their algorithms is what they extrapolate were the viewership for Book of Boba Fett. But here, of course, on Nielsen, what it's suggesting in that case is that there were many more views, or that the average viewer of the roughly, let's call it 2 million even, watched that same episode at least 5 times a piece on average. That seems a little out there. Now, I do believe that with a show like that, and especially being Star Wars, and people love to tear it apart and watch for Easter eggs and things like this, there's a lot of fans that'll watch a show like that over and over again to try to pick up on various little tidbits of information that might be hidden in the weeds. I can see an average person might view a show like that maybe twice. So the answer comes in, maybe reality is somewhere in between the 1.7 and the 11 million suggested views that Nielsen is coming in at between Samba and Nielsen. And this is where it really gets deep in the weeds. This is the problem with streaming. And without the actual streaming services like Disney or Netflix or somebody else going out there and releasing publicly that data, it's almost impossible to tell what's really going on. Now, getting back to Cobra Kai. Cobra Kai, a whopping 2.4 billion minutes viewed. And again, we're kind of left with the same problem of determining what the real legitimate measure is of viewership because of the same problems. If we look at Cobra Kai and we assume, now again, reminder that Cobra Kai came out 2 days after Book of Boba Fett, meaning that Cobra Kai only had 3 days of measurement within this window, whereas the Book of Boba Fett had 5. So Cobra Kai, 3 days, Book of Boba Fett, 5. So that's going to skew some things as well, obviously, with almost 40% more capability of view time with Book of Boba Fett than did Cobra Kai in that same period. We're really going to have to wait till the next Nielsen report comes out with viewership and streaming numbers, or streaming minutes in this case, for the week following this, beginning January 3rd. But looking at Cobra Kai with 2.4 billion minutes viewed, if we simply assume the raw average of about 30 minutes per episode, and there were 10 episodes, that's 300 minutes per viewer. If everybody binged the entire thing during that 72-hour window that this measurement captured. If we do that, we come up with a figure of about 8.3 million people. Or do we? See, in that case, it suggests that Book of Boba Fett was almost much bigger at almost 11 plus million views than was Cobra Kai. Now, I don't believe for a second that Cobra Kai didn't trounce Book of Boba Fett in terms of sheer viewership, if you actually look at the number of people who watched the series. Cobra Kai is one of the biggest things that Netflix has ever gotten its hands on, and of course Netflix has almost double the number of subscribers that Disney Plus does. So where does the rubber meet the road? What's difficult to tell is how many people actually got through the entire thing. And that's the problem. If everybody just watched one single episode of this, then it didn't get 8 million views, it got 80 million views. 80 million people watched it. If they watched 2 episodes on average during that weekend, or 3, or 4, or 5, so on and so forth, you can see where the problems come in. These numbers don't really tell us a whole lot, except to suggest that certainly people are spending in total more time watching one show versus the other. Now, if Disney Plus and Netflix were like linear television, and they had advertising in there, then these numbers would become much more meaningful. Because you see right now, places like Netflix and Disney Plus that do not have any ad-based tiers, they have no advertising to sell for a given program like they would on a regular linear television or cable network. It's very difficult to look and see what the value of a show is. Now, we've talked about in the past how Netflix has strategically leaked some data on things like Squid Game, where they assigned a quote-unquote impact value, more or less. An impact value of almost $1 billion, roughly about $890 million if memory serves, for Squid Game. Now, the way Netflix and other streaming services come up with this type of data is to look at a given user's account that would have watched, in that case, Squid Game, or perhaps Encanto, or Cobra Kai, or Book of Boba Fett, and figure out, number one, how many people signed on, and then the first thing they watched was fill-in-the-blank program. And then secondly, how much of their total time did they spend watching that program over the course of the entire billing cycle as compared to other offerings also on that service. And they come up with this phantom impact value. Now, impact value is not something you're ever going to find on a balance sheet, a financial statement, a profit and loss, anything like that. Impact value, like I said, is a phantom value that companies use for research and development on marketing. What do we need to keep making more of? Where do we need to spend our money to hold on to subs? But nowhere are you going to show a balance sheet or a profit and loss for a program like Cobra Kai or Book of Boba Fett saying, hey, we spent $100 million to make this show and it made $1 billion. It doesn't exist anywhere but in a marketing department because it's not an actual cash flow. The cash flows come in when it comes to what the actual streaming service is charging and what people are paying for on their monthly billing. Now, for other places like Discovery Plus or HBO Max's advertising tier, or for other services out there, things like Hulu that actually have ad-based content for the most part, well, then those values are more assignable as advertisers will come in and say, hey, I want to place $50 million of ads during your Cobra Kai run, or I want to spend, things like that. That's how traditional television works. That's not going on yet with a lot of these streamers, and I think it will come to that point. I definitely think at some point down the road, you're going to see ad-based tiers with places like Netflix, and almost assuredly with places like Disney+. The question becomes, how long out in the future is that going to happen? Netflix right now is already in profitability for a company as a whole. Disney, unfortunately, when it comes to Disney+, is not. Of course, there's the projection that they still will not reach profitability until roughly the end of fiscal year 2024, or September 30th of 2024. Hopefully they can get there. And of course, they still have a tall ladder to climb. Years ago when Disney Plus launched, saying that they would get to about 250 million subs, especially after COVID came through and the subscription numbers for streaming shot up. They readjusted their numbers from around 100 million to 250. I think that could come back and bite them because that is a tall ladder to climb. And again, of course, most of Disney Plus's growth has come not from within its already existing markets. It's come from other places like India. It's come from new markets they're opening up, most recently in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan and Korea. Those kind of places, like I said, that's where the growth is coming from. And when you look at Disney Plus, they have roughly 40 to 45 million by the best estimates of actual subscribers here in North America. So again, this is one of these things that we have to kind of keep an eye on. This is going to be a constantly moving target to figure out what is really going on here. But needless to say, Disney did get a streaming win with Encanto. When you look at that, that's about a 90-minute movie. When you take out the credits, you look at 2.2 billion minutes viewed. That's almost 25 million views of Encanto. Now, again, probably a lot of that was repetitious viewing because Encanto was available for that entire 7-day period during that measurement window. So if every kid out there watched it 2 or 3 times during that period, the real viewership was somewhere around maybe 8 to 15 million households, somewhere in there. But it's impossible to say, and that's the problem with this data. Only Disney, only Netflix, only HBO Max, so on and so forth, really truly know what these internal numbers are. Hopefully, these streaming services, as time goes on, are going to become a little bit more transparent with how these numbers work, what kind of views they're getting, because as they push into more ad-based revenues, which I think they will at some point, sooner than later, those numbers are going to have to come out, because if you're going to sell advertising, you have to tell advertisers what they're getting for their money. Now, as the final topic to bring all of this home comes an article today from CNBC, or really yesterday at the time that we're recording this. Streaming video no longer impresses investors, so media companies need a next act. Yeah, exactly. We've talked about this recently in another video about a week ago with the Netflix subscriber situation, to which I said, it really feels like there's an overreaction at this point because I felt like there is only so much maturity the market is going to get. There's only so much saturation the market is going to get. Continuing to expand into new territories, new international countries, that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, there comes a point to where there's not much more you can go. And people are going to have to start looking at these streaming numbers and streaming companies from a more value-oriented standpoint. They're going to have to look at things like average revenue per user, total cash flows, free cash flow that is coming into these companies to see how well their subscription services are actually doing instead of just raw numbers in terms of growth, which obviously was accelerated dramatically, as we said before, during the course of 2020 when we had the pandemic-era lockdowns and people had nowhere else to go but to find new sources of entertainment at home, and that came in large part with streaming services. From the CNBC article, superficially, it seems odd that one low Netflix quarterly forecast would scare investors from the entire segment. But if Netflix growth is slowing, then it may mean the world's total addressable streaming market is significantly lower than previously expected. And that number in the past has been upwards of 500 million total potential subscriber customers out there in the globe in terms of numbers of accounts. And they're starting to question whether those numbers were legitimate. Again, bringing home, it's not about how many subs you have per se in and of itself. It's about how profitable each one of those subscribers is to that streaming service. Seems like we were ahead of the curve. Some of the solutions presented in the article are such things like combining services or bundling. Now, this is a theory that I've had now for some years. As the number of streaming services and choices out there continues to expand, at some point, a Google, an Apple, an Amazon, one of these, or Roku, for example, one of these platforms that amalgamates a bunch of streaming services under one hardware device, like an Apple TV or a Roku or a Fire TV stick from Amazon, is going to try to start selling bundled packages where for one price, you'll get Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO Max, and Peacock and Universal and all this kind of stuff. I think that's where eventually it's going to have to go, because that's going to be a lot easier for consumers to swallow than having 5 or 6 different subscriptions. Now, a lot of these companies, we've talked about churn here before. Churn is something that they're all susceptible to. But of course, according to Bob Chapek, Disney is kind of in a unique position because according to Mr. Chapek, Disney Plus has one of the lowest, if not the lowest rate of subscriber churn in the streaming industry. All this is very fascinating, and all of this is a story that's going to play out over the next many months and potentially years before we really see something change in terms of how the analysts look at streaming data. But that's why you're here, because we're going to keep watching it. Hope everybody enjoyed the video. Please make sure you hit that like and subscribe. Don't forget about the live stream coming up this Thursday right here on Valiant Renegade with replays that are going to go off on Renegade Online. Make sure you go sub to that second channel. Again, a link will be in the description below. And please leave a comment before you head out. And until next time, as always, take care, folks.